The chandeliers of Harrogate have been dark for a year, until tonight. In a gallery veiled by dust and grief, a young maid lifts her duster and freezes. A boy's painted eyes stare back. Her missing brother, vanished 5 years ago, immortalized as the widowed duke's heir. A secret trembles on the gilt frame. Duty warns her to be silent. Desire to know the truth ignites like flame. One voice will shatter the hush. One choice will rewrite every name in this house. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what do you love most about period romances? The forbidden longing, the glittering ballrooms, or the truths that refuse to stay buried? London, England, February of the year 1856, a bitter wind wept through the streets of Belgravia, curling between the iron gates and pale stone of Harrogate House, a mansion where even sunlight dared not linger. Within its high walls and hushed halls, time moved not by clocks, but by absence. Absence in laughter, in warmth, in life. Madison Hale stood quietly in the main corridor, her fingers tightening around the worn handle of a feather duster as Mrs. Blythe's voice rang cold and precise down the stairwell. "You'll begin in the portrait gallery, Miss Hale, and mind your hands. The frames are older than your birth." Madison nodded, with the deference expected of a housemaid, even as her heart trembled beneath the coarse wool of her grey uniform. She had worked in houses before, stiff ones, cruel ones, but none had pressed silence against her lungs the way this one did. Here, even the floorboards seemed to mourn. With every step toward the far end of the manor, where the gallery waited like a sealed crypt, the air thickened. Her shoes clicked softly over polished wood as she passed windows draped in black velvet. Mourning crepe still clung to the balustrades, though it had been nearly a year since the Duchess's death, and almost as long since the passing of the heir. They said the Duke of Harrogate had not smiled since. The door to the portrait gallery groaned open beneath her touch. No fire warmed the hearth. Only cold light slanted through the long window panes, dust dancing in the beam like lost souls. The gallery stretched long and quiet, lined with ancestral eyes that watched in eternal judgment. Madison hesitated, her breath visible in the stillness. She stepped forward, lifting her duster, and began the slow rhythm of cleaning gilt and grime from the frames. The air smelled of oil paint and faded varnish, of forgotten tears and frozen time. She moved past noblemen in powdered wigs, dowagers in lace caps, officers in red coats, all of them etched in silence, all of them untouched by the dust of sorrow, until she saw him, a boy, no more than 8 years of age, seated with hands folded in his lap, a leather-bound book resting on one knee. His hair was auburn brown, unruly over one temple. His eyes, hazel solemn-wide, seemed to stare directly into hers. Madison's hand dropped. The duster fell, forgotten, to the floor. She took a step forward, then another, her heart pounding against her ribs like a warning. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the frame, not to dust it, but to anchor herself. "Jacob," she whispered, the name breaking through her lips like a prayer, like a wound. Her vision blurred. The boy in the portrait did not speak, but everything in his face cried out with familiarity. That cowlick above the left brow, that dimple in the chin, that slight turn of the shoulder. Jacob always turned slightly when nervous. She had not seen him in 5 years, but she would know that face in 1,000 lifetimes. "No," she said aloud. "No, no, it cannot be." The sound of her own voice shattered the hush. A clatter echoed behind her, the door swinging open, boots striking hardwood. Mrs. Blythe appeared, flanked by 2 footmen, their brows drawn in alarm. Madison turned, her face pale, her eyes wild. "Mrs. Blythe," she gasped, pointing toward the painting. "That boy, he can't be—" But footsteps, heavier, colder, steadier, followed the others. Arthur Pembroke entered, tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in the austerity of his black mourning coat. The Duke of Harrogate brought with him the weight of the entire house. His gaze swept over the gathering, then settled on Madison, with the full chill of January's breath. "What is the meaning of this noise?" His voice was low, controlled, honed like a blade dulled by sorrow. Madison turned fully to him, her voice breaking. "Your Grace, that boy," she pointed again, nearly choking, "that portrait. He's my little brother. His name is Jacob Hale. He was taken from me 5 years ago, and I swear to you I would know him anywhere." The Duke's expression did not change. Not at first. Then, slowly, he turned his head to the portrait. For a moment, brief as the beat of a falcon's wing, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, doubt, memory. It vanished as quickly as it came. "That is the late Viscount Ainsley," he said coolly. "My son, Edward." Madison's breath hitched. "No, Your Grace, I don't know what you've been told, but that child is not Edward. That is Jacob. He had a scar on his right wrist, shaped like a crescent, from a fall near the baker's yard. And he had a way of tugging his lower lip when nervous. Please, I beg you, look again." "You presume too much," he said, his tone sharp enough to silence the room. "You insult my grief. My son died of fever, and you—" He turned fully to her now, his voice lowering but thickening with quiet menace. "You speak of scars and childhood mannerisms as if I would not recognize my own child." "I'm not accusing you," Madison said, though her voice cracked under the weight of what she was daring. "I'm begging you. Please, Your Grace, just let me see the records, the nursery ledgers, anything. If I am wrong, I will go. I will never speak of it again. But if I am right—" Silence fell, heavy and unbearable. Mrs. Blythe's voice broke it. "Shall I have her dismissed, Your Grace?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on Madison, on the flushed cheeks, the trembling hands, the defiant sorrow in her hazel eyes. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to the portrait, his jaw clenched. "No," he said at last. "She may stay, for now." He turned and walked out. Mrs. Blythe stared at Madison as if she were a smudge on polished silver. The footmen followed the Duke, the door closed behind them, and Madison stood alone again in the gallery. She turned back to the portrait, tears slipping freely now. "I will find you," she whispered to the painted boy, "even if it costs me everything." Behind her, the dust swirled in the cold beam of light, as if the house itself had begun to stir. The morning after the outburst in the portrait gallery dawned grey and brittle, as if London itself had paused to withhold its breath. A light rain tapped at the tall windows of Harrogate House, washing the stone with a sorrowful sheen. Within the labyrinth of servant corridors and shuttered halls, no one dared speak of what had happened. But they all knew. In houses such as this, rumour moved faster than fire. Madison Hale sat alone in the servants' hall, her untouched breakfast growing cold on the chipped ceramic plate before her. The silence around her was not unfamiliar. She had eaten in silence most of her life. But this silence was different. This one was weighted with accusation. The other maids cast her sidelong glances, whispers following each clatter of a teacup or spoon. A footman passing behind her paused just long enough to mutter, "Foolish girl," before disappearing into the corridor. Mrs. Blythe had said nothing since the incident. Her silence was sharper than scorn. Madison's hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled with barely contained urgency. Every beat of her heart echoed the same thought. I must speak to him. I must make him see. Not for her sake, but for Jacob's. By the time the grandfather clock in the corridor struck 10, she stood, straightened her apron, and walked with quiet determination toward the housekeeper's office. Her knock was firm but respectful. "Mrs." Blythe looked up from her ledger, her pale eyes unreadable. "I need to speak with the Duke," Madison said softly. "Please. I will not raise my voice again. I only ask one moment of his time." The older woman studied her for a long, breathless moment. "You are fortunate His Grace has not already had you removed for your behavior yesterday," she said at last. "He does not tolerate disorder, nor does this house." "I understand," Madison replied. But what I said, I meant every word. Mrs. Blythe closed her ledger with slow precision. I'll inform His Grace that you've requested an audience, she said. You will wait in the west antechamber. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for your own sake, Miss Hale, pray he is in a merciful mood. Half an hour later, Madison found herself in the shadowed chamber outside the Duke's private study. She stood alone, the air heavy with the scent of leather-bound books and old smoke. Rain traced quiet fingers down the tall windows, and somewhere down the corridor, a clock struck the half-hour with reluctant chimes. Then the door opened. A footman motioned silently, and Madison stepped into the study. The room was grand but dark, the only illumination coming from a small fire in the hearth and a solitary lamp on the Duke's desk. Shelves climbed the walls, filled with law books and volumes on estate management. The curtains were drawn, the furniture carved and sombre. Arthur Pembroke stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his black coat a silhouette against the grey light. He did not turn when she entered. "You have 5 minutes," he said without preamble. Madison swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Your Grace, I know what I said in the gallery must have seemed mad, disrespectful even, but I need you to understand I wasn't lying. That boy in the portrait, he's not your son. He's my brother." The Duke turned slowly. In the dim light, his face was a mask carved in grief and stone. His eyes, cold and impossibly clear, rested on her like the gaze of a magistrate awaiting guilt. "My son," he said quietly, "died of scarlet fever. I held his body in my arms. I buried him with my own hands. And you, a maid newly entered into my household, presume to tell me otherwise." "I'm not questioning your grief, Your Grace," Madison said gently. "I believe that you lost someone you loved. I believe you mourn him still. But I also believe that the child in that painting is not the one you buried." The Duke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Madison pressed forward, heart pounding. "My brother Jacob was taken from a workhouse queue. I searched for him for years. I've walked through every street, every charity house, every parish hall, and then yesterday I walked into your gallery and saw the face I thought I'd never see again. His eyes, his mouth, even the scar above his wrist. It's him. I swear it." He turned back to the window, silent. "I'm not asking you to believe me outright," she continued. "I know how this must sound. I'm just asking for a chance. Let me look at the nursery ledgers, the household accounts, the names of nurses who served at that time. If I find nothing, I'll leave quietly. But if I find something—" He spoke at last, voice low and measured. "You think this house is a place where chaos may take root, Miss Hale? Where servants march into their master's study and demand access to private records? You mistake Harrogate for a courtroom, or perhaps for a market stall, where truth is bartered like cloth." Madison said nothing. He turned slowly and regarded her again. His expression was unreadable, but beneath the surface, something moved. Not belief, not yet, but not indifference either. "I'll not have the dignity of my house further undone by a servant's crusade," he said, "but I will give you one chance. You may remain. You will continue your duties as assigned. If in the course of those duties you find anything that substantiates your claim, I will consider granting access to the family archives." He paused. "You have 1 month. Fail to maintain discipline among the staff, and you will be dismissed. Speak of this to anyone else, and you will be dismissed. Is that clear?" Madison bowed her head. "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you." He nodded once, then moved to the desk, dismissing her with the motion. But as she turned to leave, he spoke again, so softly that she almost missed it. "What did you say the child's name was?" She stopped, breath caught in her throat. "Jacob," she whispered. The fire crackled. The Duke said nothing more. Madison stepped out of the study and closed the door behind her. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of damp earth and possibility. Mrs. Blythe was waiting at the end of the corridor, arms folded. "Well?" she asked. Madison lifted her chin, voice calm despite the storm within her. I remain under His Grace's employment." The housekeeper's brow arched, but she said nothing more. She turned and walked away, the keys at her waist chiming softly. Madison stood in the hall a moment longer, her heart steadying. She had 1 month. 1 month to untangle the web of secrets within Harrogate House, and somewhere within these walls, beneath velvet and stone and silence, was the truth. She would find it, even if it meant unraveling everything. The upper floors of Harrogate House stood like a mausoleum sealed in velvet and silence. Long corridors, whispered with the weight of footsteps never taken. Dust clung to corners, untouched by sunlight. Though the house was grand, its ceilings high, its moulding gilded, its furniture carved from the finest mahogany, it carried the unmistakable scent of a grief too long preserved. Not a fresh grief, raw and unruly, but one aged into something ritualistic and cold. Madison Hale ascended the main staircase with her cleaning pail in hand and a linen cloth folded neatly over her arm. Her shoes made little sound over the carpet runner, but each step echoed within her like a question still unanswered. The upper floor housed the private chambers of the family. Though she had been given permission to work throughout the house, Mrs. Blythe's instructions had been clear. Touch nothing without care, speak to no one unless addressed, and remain invisible unless summoned. Madison had lived her life unseen, but today something in her was shifting. At the end of the corridor, a heavy door stood ajar, the girls' schoolroom. She stepped inside quietly, unsure if it was empty. The room smelled of lavender sachets and old books. A long window looked out over the barren winter garden below. A writing desk sat untouched, its inkwell sealed and clean. A chalkboard bore the faint outline of letters written long ago, a lesson abandoned mid-thought. And in the corner, half concealed by a worn tapestry, a child sat curled beneath a window seat, hugging her knees. It was Charlotte, the younger of the Duke's daughters. Her hair, a tumble of golden-brown curls, spilled over her shoulders. She wore a black silk dress with velvet cuffs, far too formal for the playfulness that should have marked her age. She looked up at Madison without fear, but without curiosity either. "You're the maid who shouted," she said simply. Madison dipped her head. "Yes, miss, I am." Charlotte rested her chin on her knees, eyes thoughtful. "You're not like the others. They pretend not to see us." "That's because they've been told to look away," Madison replied softly, approaching with caution. "But I was taught that children are not shadows." Charlotte blinked, and for the first time something resembling wonder softened her features. "What were you shouting about?" Madison hesitated, then sat on the edge of the window seat, keeping a respectful distance. "Someone I loved went missing once," she said, "and yesterday I saw a painting that looked very much like him." "Was it Edward?" Charlotte asked, her voice dropping into a whisper. "That's the boy in the portrait, my brother." Madison's throat tightened. "He had another name, I think, before this house, before the painting." Charlotte tilted her head, curls brushing her cheek. "You believe he was someone else?" Madison did not answer directly. Instead, she gave the child a small folded paper bird she had fashioned that morning from scrap. "I believe truth can wear many names before it is recognized." Charlotte took it reverently, as if it were a treasure. "Eleanor says we are not to speak of him, not when father is near, not even when we're alone. Do you remember him?" "I remember music," she whispered, "and laughing, and a woman crying. But I'm not sure what was real and what was dream." Madison's heart twisted. She stood and resumed her duties, her hands moving over the shelves with practiced care. As she dusted the corners of the room, she found, tucked behind a row of old Latin primers, a small, leather-bound prayer book. Its pages were stiff with age. She opened it, fingers brushing across the delicate gold leaf on the inside cover. The name Edward Pembroke was written in a shaky hand, but several pages had been torn out, cleanly, and not recently. She turned the book over, her brows furrowing. Why would someone remove prayers from a child's devotional? And why so precisely? She slipped it into her apron pocket just as the schoolroom door creaked. Eleanor stood there, tall and slender, her chestnut hair braided tightly, her morning gown immaculate. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held a wary flame. "You are not assigned to this room," she said. Madison inclined her head. "Forgive me, Miss Pembroke, I was only dusting." Eleanor looked past her toward Charlotte, who still clutched the paper bird. Her lips thinned. "Charlotte, come. You'll catch cold sitting on the floor." Charlotte stood but lingered beside Madison. "She's kind." Eleanor's gaze did not soften. "Kindness can be dangerous if it is not earned." Madison held her ground. "And silence can be cruel when it's worn as armor." The two locked eyes. For a moment, the room filled with a silent understanding neither could speak aloud. Eleanor turned sharply and walked away. Charlotte followed, though she looked over her shoulder and gave Madison a quiet smile. Left alone, Madison returned to her tasks. Later that afternoon, in the linen room, she overheard two scullery maids talking in low voices. Left without a word, she did. One day she was here, the next gone, never even collected her final wages. Was that the nursemaid, the one who cared for the heir? They say she saw something, or heard something she wasn't supposed to. Madison, hidden behind a stack of freshly folded napkins, listened intently. "Mrs. Blythe won't speak of it," one said, "but I heard she went straight to the Duke's study before she left. Red-eyed, shaking. They sent a carriage for her, didn't they? A fast one." That evening, Madison returned to the gallery after the household had settled into the rhythms of dusk. The corridor was dimly lit by gas sconces, their flickering light throwing long shadows across the polished floor. She stood before the portrait once more, heart aching. She no longer doubted it. The painting was not just familiar, it was Jacob. His features immortalized in brushstrokes and oil, trapped in a lie that stretched its roots through every corridor of this sorrow-bound house. She touched the edge of the frame, the gold leaf cool beneath her fingers. Behind her the silence deepened, but no longer felt suffocating. For the first time, Harrogate House seemed to be listening and waiting. The days that followed moved like slow molasses through the great arteries of Harrogate House, thick with ritual, burdened with silence. Beneath every task Madison Hale performed, polishing candelabras, folding linen napkins, brushing ash from the hearths, there pulsed a deeper purpose. She had not come to the estate merely to serve. She had come to uncover what had been buried beneath velvet and grief. On a grey morning veiled in mist, she stood alone in the linen archives behind the east wing, where heavy oaken shelves reached from floor to ceiling, and the scent of starch and lavender oil filled the narrow aisles. Sunlight barely reached that far back in the house, and time seemed to bend within those walls. She had been sent to inventory napkins, but her fingers moved deliberately toward the bottom shelf where the oldest, rarely used ledgers were kept. Hidden beneath a pile of yellowing sheets and table runners, she found a worn, leather-bound volume, the household account book for the year of the supposed heir's birth. She laid it on the long sorting table, glancing toward the door. Alone. Carefully, she turned the brittle pages, her eyes darting through lists of expenses, coal deliveries, starch, candle wax, linens ordered from Mayfair, horse feed. And then, donation, parish of St. Olwyn's, baptismal fee, 2 guineas. Madison frowned. St. Olwyn's? She had lived her entire life in the poorer quarters of London and had never heard of such a parish. Nor had it appeared in any of the city's charitable listings she had read during her years of searching. Her fingers stilled. The ink was faded, but the hand was careful and ornate, too deliberate, too clean. She made note of the entry and returned the book to its place before anyone could question her presence. But the name stuck in her mind like a thorn beneath silk. That evening, she returned to the portrait gallery to dust. The room, still bathed in its silent gloom, held its usual sentinels of oil and canvas, dukedoms long gone, countesses who had ruled from behind fans and jewels, generals painted astride horses. And at the far end, beneath a velvet drape now perpetually drawn aside, stood the portrait of the boy, Jacob, or Edward, as they insisted he had been. Madison moved toward it with her cloth in hand, though she had no intention of dusting. Her eyes scanned the frame again. A nameplate, polished and inlaid with mother-of-pearl, read, Edward Pembroke, Viscount Ainsley, in his 8th year. But there was no date, no artist's name. She stepped closer. The brushstrokes were confident. The shadows along the jawline soft. Whoever had painted the child had known him well. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded slip of paper, the copied note of the false baptismal fee. "You didn't come from St. Alwyn's," she murmured. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, his dark form outlined by the flickering gaslight in the corridor. "I find you here often," he said. Madison's breath caught. She curtsied, eyes lowered. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I was instructed to maintain the gallery." "I did not ask for forgiveness," he replied, stepping inside. She straightened slowly, daring to meet his gaze. His eyes were unreadable, but in the hush between them, something shifted. "I watched you this morning," he said, "in the linen room. You sift through ledgers as if you were born to numbers." "I read well," she said simply. "Most maids cannot read at all. My mother taught me letters when I was little, and my brother, he loved to be read to." A beat passed, the silence thickened. "You still believe he is the boy in that portrait?" he said at last. "I do. And yet you still work, still sweep ash and polish brass." "I made a promise," she said quietly. "Long before I stepped into this house, I will not break it even if my hands are raw with labor." He looked at her for a long moment, then moved to stand beside the portrait. "I watched him die," he said. "I heard his breathing grow ragged. I felt the stillness when it stopped." Madison swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "I don't doubt your grief, Your Grace, but I wonder, is it possible that someone wanted you to believe that?" He said nothing. She took a step forward, close enough now to feel the tension in the air between them, as if the very molecules strained to close the gap. Yet neither moved. "I found something," she said. "An entry in the accounts. A baptism fee for a parish that doesn't exist." Still silence. "I've searched for him for 5 years," she continued, her voice low but unwavering. "Every alley, every parish, every orphanage. I have knocked on doors with nothing but hope to feed me. And now, here, he is staring back at me from your wall." His jaw tightened. "If what you believe is true, then everything I've lived with for years is a lie." Madison's eyes did not leave his. "And if it is a lie, Your Grace, wouldn't you rather know it?" For a moment, she thought he might turn and walk away. But instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out something small, round, silver. He held it out to her, palm open. A baby's rattle, ornate, polished, engraved. She took it, breath held. The initials were not EP, as she expected. They were JH. Her knees nearly buckled. He spoke before she could ask. "I found it hidden behind the drawer in my late wife's dressing table. I do not know how it came to be there, but I have not spoken of it. Not to anyone." Madison clutched the rattle to her chest, as if it were a sacred relic. "You kept it," she whispered. "I could not let it go," he said. Their eyes met, his hollowed by loss, hers shining with the fire of relentless hope. They stood in the heart of the house, surrounded by ghosts and paint and shadows, and something began to stir beneath the surface. Not yet trust, not yet belief, but the first soft breath of possibility. It was on a Tuesday morning, brittle with cold and washed in grey light, that the door to the late Duchess's private suite creaked open for the first time in nearly a year. The heavy key, delivered by Mrs. Blythe without ceremony, had rested on Madison Hale's palm like a sentence and a promise. She had waited days for it, The Duke had spoken few words when granting her permission, only that she was to treat the rooms with respect and to remember that not everything lost was meant to be found. And yet, even as he uttered those cautionary words, there had been something else behind them, a quiet loosening, a surrender of resistance he could no longer justify. Now, Madison stepped over the threshold with slow reverence, her shoes barely making sound against the thick Aubusson carpet. The Duchess's chambers had not been stripped or repurposed. Everything remained as it was, immaculate, frozen, sacred. The scent of rosewater clung faintly to the air, a ghost of a fragrance that once marked presence. Velvet curtains filtered the morning into a gentle haze. The dressing table bore an untouched silver brush and comb. A dressing gown of midnight silk, embroidered with chrysanthemums, still hung on the back of the chair. No woman had touched it since the Duchess last breathed. Madison's chest ached with the palpable weight of unspoken grief. She moved slowly, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of the writing desk. Locked, but beneath it, within the lower compartment, she found a small, leather-bound journal. Not labelled, not marked, tucked behind volumes of poetry and an unused box of stationery. The edges were worn, the corners softened. This was no ornament. This was a vessel. She sat on the cushioned window seat, the light falling softly over her shoulder, and began to read. The first pages were full of ordinary observations, a description of the rain, a reference to a ball, a musing on the colour of lilies. But further in, the tone began to shift, the sentences shortened, the ink grew uneven. And then, "He is mine now, no one must ever know." Madison's breath stopped. I looked into his eyes and felt God's forgiveness. The silence in the nursery is broken at last. Arthur does not ask. He does not question. He is afraid to. So am I. But what mother would not do the same? Her hands shook as she turned the next page. The midwife was kind, efficient. She said the mother never returned for him, that he was healthy, strong, a gift. I told her the child would want for nothing, and he has not. He sleeps in silk now. He is my son. He must be. Madison's vision blurred. There was more. Names were not given, but there were references to a charity home in Clerkenwell, and the woman with the scar on her temple. And finally, I will commission the portrait soon. Once it hangs, it will be real. He will be real. A sob caught in her throat. She clutched the journal to her chest and sat motionless for several long minutes. Outside the window, the winter garden stood bare, skeletal trees rattling in the wind. Below them, the house continued its rituals, bells ringing faintly, footsteps on stone, life moving forward in ignorance. But within the Duchess's suite, Madison had uncovered a truth that changed everything. Later that afternoon, summoned by the Duke, she entered the study with the journal pressed to her heart. He stood by the fire, his silhouette rigid, framed by flickering flame. He did not look at her at first. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Blythe," he said. "She will join us shortly." Madison said nothing, her breath tight. "I asked you to tread carefully," he continued, "and yet you pry into what was buried for a reason." His voice was not angry. It was tired, frayed. She stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "You said once that not everything lost was meant to be found, but some things find their way back, regardless." He finally turned. His eyes fell on the journal in her hands. She offered it to him without a word. He took it, opened to the marked page, and read. The silence stretched impossibly long. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I suspected something, but I told myself it was grief, that I was imagining things, that her softness, her need, could not have led her to such deception." Madison's voice trembled. She wanted to love again, and she did, but love does not erase origin, not even a mother's. The door opened. Mrs. Blythe entered, her keys clinking faintly at her waist. She paused when she saw Madison and the journal in the Duke's hand. He turned to her. "Tell me the truth." The housekeeper's mouth twitched. Her composure held, but only just. "I was not part of the arrangement, Your Grace, but I came to suspect. I found correspondence hidden in the nursery fireplace grate, scraps of letters signed only with initials. I questioned the steward. He told me not to interfere. Bring him, the Duke said. Moments later, Mr. Pelham, the steward, stooped, grey-haired and cautious, stood before them, hands folded. The Duke spoke again, his tone iron. You will answer honestly. No more shadows. Pelham hesitated. Then his shoulders sagged. It was her doing, he admitted. After the stillbirth, she was inconsolable. She wrote to a woman who had connections, quiet connections, children abandoned, orphaned, or unwanted. The boy was brought here in the night. Madison's hands curled into fists. He was never to stay long, only until her sorrow passed. But she called him Edward within hours, and when she smiled again, we let it be. And the portrait, the Duke asked. She commissioned it herself, told the painter he was the heir. Once it hung, none questioned it. Madison's voice came quiet, broken. What happened when the guilt returned? Pelham looked down. She fell ill, not physically, spiritually. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. She told me she feared he would be taken from her, that God would punish her. He paused. I arranged for the child to be sent away, quietly, without scandal. I told her he had died. It was the only way she would let him go. The Duke looked as if the air had left the room. You told her he died. I did. The fire popped in the hearth. Madison closed her eyes, her lips trembling. The boy had not died. He had been cast out from a lie and buried under another. Where was he sent? The Duke asked. Pelham hesitated again. To Kent, a vicarage, a small one. The woman who arranged it said it would be safe. The records, I can find them. You will, the Duke said, immediately. He dismissed them all with a gesture. When Madison turned to leave, his voice stopped her. You were right. She turned back slowly. I did not want to know, because knowing would mean losing him again. But what you've given me is a second chance. Their eyes met in the dim glow of firelight. No words passed between them then, but something was exchanged all the same, something stronger than silence, and far more lasting than lies. The road to Kent wound through frozen hedgerows and snow-dusted fields, stretching like a ribbon of grey silk beneath a sky the colour of tin. The hired carriage moved in silence, its wheels cracking through pockets of frost, the horse's breath rising in puffs of white steam. Inside, cloaked in heavy wool, Madison sat across from the Duke of Harrogate, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither spoke. Not because words had failed them, but because none could yet hold the weight of what they were about to face. Outside the narrow window, the countryside shifted. Fields gave way to narrow lanes, to low stone walls and shuttered cottages. Birds huddled beneath empty trees. Smoke curled from chimneys like ribbons of warmth. The world was smaller here, simpler, and yet to Madison it felt vast and holy. It was here, in this quiet corner of Kent, that the truth of everything might be waiting in the eyes of a boy. When the carriage slowed, the driver called out through the flurries. They had reached the vicarage. A modest stone house stood at the end of a narrow drive, its windows glowing with the amber light of late afternoon. Ivy clung to the eaves like a shawl. The garden beyond was bare, the remnants of summer's roses now nothing more than dry brambles dusted with frost. Madison stepped out first, her boots crunching against the gravel, the cold rushing to her cheeks. She glanced up at the house and pressed one hand to her chest. The Duke followed, his posture as composed as ever, though she sensed the tightness in his shoulders. He carried nothing, not even a cane or gloves. Only tension and the long-held burden of what he might have to face. The vicar, a soft-spoken man with thinning blonde grey hair and eyes like pale glass, answered the door before they could knock. He wore a thick wool cardigan over his clerical collar, and his spectacles perched precariously at the end of his nose. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I believe I received word of your arrival." The Duke inclined his head. "Thank you, Reverend Trent. We won't take more of your time than necessary." The vicar studied them a moment longer, then stepped aside to let them in. The warmth of the vicarage enveloped them like a balm. The air was scented with cloves and bread still baking. The hallway was narrow, the walls lined with hand-sewn samplers and modest oil landscapes. It was a home crafted with love, not legacy. "Please sit," the vicar said, guiding them to the small parlour. "My sister is with the children in the back room. I'll fetch Henry." And at the sound of the name, Madison felt her breath falter. The Duke, standing by the fire, did not move. Moments passed, and then footsteps, light, quick, unburdened, and a boy appeared in the doorway. He was 8, perhaps a little tall for his age. His cheeks were flushed with winter's air, and his dark auburn hair fell in loose, familiar curls over his forehead. His hazel eyes, oh, those eyes, swept the room with polite curiosity. "Henry," the vicar said gently, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder, "these are visitors from London. They knew your family long ago." The boy turned to them, a smile forming at the edges of his mouth. Madison's knees weakened. She clasped her hands to still the tremor. "Good afternoon," he said, with the careful courtesy of a child well loved. She tried to speak. She couldn't. He tilted his head, studying her. "You look sad, miss," he said. The words, so innocent, shattered her. She knelt before him slowly, cautiously, as if he were made of spun glass. "My name is Madison," she whispered. "And once, very long ago, I had a brother who looked just like you." The boy blinked, then glanced at the vicar. "She's telling the truth," the vicar said softly. "There are things we never told you, Henry, because you were too young to understand." The child looked between them, his brow furrowing. "I don't want to leave," he said, voice suddenly trembling. "Auntie says I can stay here forever." "No one will take you away," Madison said quickly, tears slipping from her lashes. "No one, I promise." The Duke remained silent, but his gaze had not left the boy's face. Something warred within him, shock, sorrow, recognition. He stepped forward. "Do you remember this?" he asked, holding out the silver rattle. The boy's eyes lit with recognition. "Yes, that was mine. I used to keep it by my bed." The room stood still. The Duke lowered his hand, the rattle trembling slightly as he set it on the table. "You are well cared for here," he said quietly. Henry nodded. Madison stood, heart breaking and full all at once. Later, in the vicar's small study, Reverend Trent explained everything. The boy arrived just over 5 years ago. He was placed through private means, discreet but not illegal. My sister and I were told he had no surviving family and needed a home. We named him Henry. He became ours in every way that mattered. "You love him," Madison said. "We do," the vicar replied. "But if you wish to reclaim him—" "No," Madison said. The word came like a bell toll. She turned to the Duke, her eyes shining. "He's happy. He's safe. He's not a secret here. He's a child, loved, seen, cherished. To pull him from this would be cruelty in the name of comfort. I won't do it, not even for my own heart." The Duke looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if she had changed form before his very eyes, from a maid into something rare and resplendent. "You would give him up," he said, his voice low. "I never had him," she answered, "but I prayed he would be warm, and he is." The fire cracked softly. The vicar nodded. "Then let us find a way forward that honors what was and what is." Before they left, Henry hugged Madison without hesitation. His small arms clung to her neck, and when he pulled back, he smiled. "You can visit, right?" "Always," she said, her voice catching. As the carriage rolled away from the vicarage, Madison stared out the window in silence. The Duke sat beside her, but no longer a distant figure, no longer a man of shadows and scorn. There was something human in him now, something humbled. After a long stretch of road, he spoke. "You loved him more than your need." Madison turned to him. "And you watched him walk away without claiming what your title could have demanded." Their eyes held, not as master and servant, but as two souls who had stood in the presence of love and let it live. Outside, the snow began to fall, not heavy, but soft, like blessing. The carriage wheels had barely settled upon the gravel drive of Harrogate House when the first whispers began to stir, silent at first, like a wind beneath the floorboards, barely noticed by those too caught in their routines. But servants notice everything. And in a house like Harrogate, silence was never truly still. It simply waited to be broken. By the time Madison stepped down from the carriage, the frost-laced air carried with it a shift, an unspoken change. She had left the house a maid, uncertain and shrouded in questions. Now she returned, having touched the edge of truth, and with it, sorrow, mercy, and something she dared not name. The Duke walked beside her, neither speaking nor offering his arm. And yet their pace matched, their steps unhurried, as though both understood they had crossed a threshold that could never be recrossed. Inside, the great hall received them with its usual hush. A maid curtsied, a footman bowed, but their eyes lingered. By supper, the halls murmured. By dawn, the drawing-room echoed with footsteps it had not heard in weeks. By noon, Lady Clarimond Ashley, cousin to the late Duchess, arrived in a gleaming black landau, pulled by 4 white horses and cloaked in indignation. She did not request an audience. She demanded one. "You will see me, Arthur," she announced in front of the butler, her bonnet still pinned and her gloves unshed, "or I shall assume the worst and act accordingly." Within the hour she stood in the Duke's study, her frame wrapped in mourning lace that did little to soften her eyes, sharp, suspicious, and gleaming with the thrill of discontent. "I hear," she began, each word clipped like a blade, "that you've been seen travelling with a servant, that you've brought scandal to the gates of Harrogate, and are now permitting a maid to speak of things far beyond her station." The Duke remained standing. The fire crackled softly behind him, the only sound in the room besides the tapping of Lady Clarimond's cane upon the polished floor. "I have travelled with Miss Hale, yes," he said. "She is a housemaid." "She is more than that." Clarimond's lips curled. "You forget yourself, and your station." "I remember my conscience," he replied. Clarimond approached, eyes narrowing. "There are those who would see this household fall. You know how eager the lords are to feast on a wounded name. What you allow within these walls will echo across the halls of Parliament." "Then let it echo," he said. "I will not live in shadows any more." But even as he spoke the words, a letter arrived, anonymous, unsigned, bearing a seal pressed into black wax. The message was simple. "We know what happened to the child. Silence has a price, £10,000, paid within the fortnight." It was not the first threat he had received in his life, but it was the first that reached into the hollow of his chest and threatened to rip open what little peace he had found. The Duke crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fire, but the damage was done. The storm outside raged quietly. The storm within was just beginning. Madison, unaware of the letter but sensing the shift, found herself increasingly isolated. Servants who once nodded with cautious respect now turned their backs. Conversations stilled when she entered the room. Her linen assignments were doubled, and Mrs. Blythe, though still composed, watched her with a wariness she had never shown before. Even the girls, Eleanor and Charlotte, had grown quiet again, until one afternoon, when Eleanor entered the gallery. Madison had been dusting the frame of a painting near the window, her thoughts far from her task, when the soft tread of footsteps reached her ears. Eleanor stood with her arms folded across her chest, her face unreadable. "I heard my name," she said. Madison turned. "Pardon? You were speaking with my father 2 nights ago. I heard my name. I also heard the word portrait." Madison straightened. "I did not mean for you to hear." "I did." Eleanor took a step closer. "I want to know. I deserve to know." Madison hesitated. She had no instruction, no permission to speak. But something in Eleanor's eyes, so much like her father's, but clearer, more open, compelled her. "The boy in that portrait," Madison said carefully, may not have been who your family believed he was. And your father, he is trying to make things right. Eleanor's breath caught. Did you know him? She asked. The boy? Madison's voice softened. He was my brother. Eleanor turned to the portrait. The silence stretched between them like a thread. Charlotte remembers him. I barely do, but she dreams of him sometimes. I think, deep down, I always knew something wasn't right. She turned back to Madison. Is he alive? Yes, Madison whispered. Safe, loved. Eleanor nodded once, and then with a composure far beyond her years, she said, Then I'm glad. Later that evening, the Duke summoned the household to the main hall. Servants gathered in stiff lines. The girls stood at the base of the stairs. Lady Clarimond, ever the hawk, lingered near the mantelpiece with a satisfied smirk, as if preparing to witness Madison's dismissal. The Duke stood tall before them all. I have kept this house in mourning for a long time, he began, out of respect, out of sorrow. But in doing so, I have also allowed silence to reign, and silence is not always noble. Sometimes it is cowardice. Murmurs swept the room. Lady Clarimond narrowed her eyes. The Duke continued. There are truths that have come to light, truths about the boy we once called Edward. I will not speak them all aloud, but I will say this. Miss Hale has sought justice, not scandal. She has shown more honor than many born into privilege, and in this house, from this day forward, she will not be treated as less than that. Clarimond stepped forward. You cannot be serious. I am. His voice rang like thunder. And should you speak of it beyond these walls, know that I will meet you in court with the full weight of my title. The room fell silent. Madison stood near the back, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched at her sides. After the crowd dispersed, the Duke found her in the gallery. She stood before the portrait once again, the light of the setting sun painting her features in gold and shadow. You defended me, she said without turning. I told the truth, he replied. She turned then, slowly, and what passed between them in that moment could not be spoken. He stepped closer, his hand reaching, then pausing, hovering just above hers. She looked up at him, her lips parted, her breath shallow. His fingers brushed hers, barely, and then, with all the weight of restrained feeling, he bent his head and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. A kiss not of possession, but reverence. She trembled and pulled her hand back. I don't know what this is, she whispered. Neither do I, he said, but I know it is real. She shook her head, backing away, her heart thundering against her ribs. I'm afraid of hope, she confessed. It always costs too much. He stepped back, giving her space. Then let us pay in silence until you are ready. And with that he left her there, alone in the golden hush, where silence for the first time felt like possibility. Winter in London bore the scent of iron and coal, of damp stone and closed shutters, of promises postponed until spring. A sallow light filtered through the tall windows of the law offices on Bedford Row, casting pale rectangles onto the waxed floorboards. The Duke of Harrogate sat at the head of a long oak table, his gloved hands folded before him, his eyes steady as marble. Across from him sat his solicitor, Mr. Durham, flanked by a second man, severe, meticulously groomed, and watching the Duke with the cold curiosity of a predator. The second man was Lord Percival Haddon, Member of Parliament and third cousin to the late Duchess of Harrogate. I trust, Haddon began, his voice dry as a paper cut, that your Grace has considered the wider implications of your charitable efforts. I am not requesting your trust, the Duke replied, voice calm. Only your silence. That, said Haddon with a thin smile, is precisely what concerns me. He leaned forward. There are whispers that you intend to establish a legal guardianship over a child of uncertain origin. The son of a seamstress, was it? Perhaps a street girl. The rumors shift with the wind. Regardless, the implications are clear. If you acknowledge him in any form, you risk the legitimacy of your line, and worse, You risk the guardianship of your daughters." A chill settled over the room. Durham cleared his throat, attempting diplomacy. "There is nothing in the law that prohibits a nobleman from assigning his wealth or protection to a child in another household, provided there is no intent to alter inheritance rights." "But that's not what people will believe," Haddon cut in. "And beliefs, gentlemen, move the world faster than facts. The House is restless. The peerage eyes your silence with suspicion. If you cause unrest, I assure you it will not be contained." The Duke did not flinch. "Are you threatening to challenge my custody of Eleanor and Charlotte?" "I'm reminding you of the fragility of reputation," Haddon said. A silence fell between them, the kind that weighed more than sound. Later that evening, as dusk bled into the alleys and fog crept along the Thames, the Duke stood at the edge of a modest cemetery in Kensington. A single stone marked the grave of the woman he had once called his wife. It was unadorned, as she had requested. No marble angels, no poetic inscriptions. Only her name and the date of her death etched cleanly into the stone. He stared at it for a long time, the damp earth at his feet soft from recent rain. "I mourned you longer than I loved you," he said quietly. "Not because I didn't try to love you, I did, but you built a house of silence, and I lived in it as if it were truth." The wind stirred the trees, bare branches rattling like brittle bones overhead. "You brought a child into this house, a boy who wasn't yours. You lied to me, but perhaps I lied too, by letting myself believe, by calling grief devotion, by calling comfort love." His voice wavered, and for the first time in many years his eyes stung. "I buried a lie, and I mourned it as if it were my son." He closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of cold grass and stone. "His name is Jacob," he said at last. "And he lives. He laughs. He belongs to someone better than me." The wind hushed, as if the world had stopped to listen. That night, he returned to Harrogate. He did not knock at Madison's door. Instead, he waited until she passed through the south corridor, her arms full of folded linen, her brow furrowed with the weight of the day. When she saw him, she stopped, startled. "Your Grace," she said softly. "Arthur," he corrected, stepping closer. "Please." She searched his face. It was different tonight. Not weary, not wounded, but resolute. He took the linen from her arms and set it gently on the table nearby. Then he looked at her, truly looked, as if he had finally allowed himself to see her not as a servant, not as a thread in the unraveling fabric of his past, but as the one person who had stood, unflinching, at the mouth of a storm and chosen truth. "I went to Kensington," he said. She nodded slowly, understanding. "I told her everything," he continued, "and I told myself more. I have lived a life shaped by silence, by duty, by fear of scandal. And for what? To be alone in a house filled with ghosts." He stepped closer. "I want to give him a future," he said, "not by taking him away from the only family he's ever known, but by standing behind him, quietly, legally, with no title, no claim, only support." She blinked, her eyes shining. "You would do that. I would do more. But that is the beginning." Madison took a trembling breath. "There are men who move heaven and earth for glory, and men who do it for land. But you—" "I do it for a boy who was almost lost to both," he said. She stepped back, overwhelmed. "I don't know how to live in a world where men like you exist." He smiled faintly. "Then let me show you." She shook her head, but her tears betrayed her. "You will be ruined. They're already watching." "I've lived in the service of their approval," he replied. "I can live without it now." She stared at him, heart torn between the dream and the danger. "If you do this," she whispered, "there's no going back." He reached for her hand. "I know." And with that, the choice was made. Not in Parliament, not in court, but in the quiet space between two people who had lost everything and found in each other the courage to choose something greater than survival. Something almost like peace, almost like love. In the weeks that followed, the paperwork was drawn with care and subtlety. The vicar in Kent received it with gratitude. The guardianship was named, the trust secured, the scandal never formally spoken, yet never again denied. The child remained Henry to the world, but Jacob in the silent, sacred space shared only by those who knew. And in that act of quiet defiance, the Duke reclaimed not only a boy, he reclaimed his soul. The chandeliers of Harrogate House had not been lit in nearly 4 years. Once they had glimmered over lavish banquets, diplomatic gatherings, cotillions of whispered promises and carefully arranged unions. But since the Duchess's passing, the ballroom had remained in mourning, its mirrors veiled, its floors silenced, its walls haunted by absence. Until tonight. Servants moved with reverent urgency. Gleaming trays of champagne and crystal were arranged on polished sideboards. The marble floor had been swept until it shone like moonlight on a lake. Fresh arrangements of white lilac and English ivy crowned every alcove, and golden candlelight danced along the edges of silver sconces, bringing the room to life. London society had arrived in full force. Ladies in satin and velvet, draped in diamonds and expectation, moved like orchestrated tides. Gentlemen in black coats and white gloves murmured behind tall glasses. A string quartet played near the West Arch, their notes rippling like silk through the perfumed air. It was the first reception hosted by the Duke of Harrogate since his wife's death, and its sudden announcement had stirred the ton into a frenzy of speculation. Some whispered of remarriage. Others assumed it was a political move, a distraction from rumors of scandal and orphanage trusts. But no one expected what was to come. Madison stood near the top of the grand staircase, half shielded by a marble column, her breath shallow beneath the weight of her new gown. It was not silk. She had declined it. Instead, she wore a rich dove-grey velvet, modest in design, with ivory buttons trailing from her collarbone to her waist. Her hair had been gathered into a soft chignon, and around her throat lay a single strand of pearls, gifted by the Duke's youngest daughter that very morning. Below, the sea of voices hummed louder, and then the orchestra stopped. Every eye turned as Arthur Pembroke entered. The Duke moved with unflinching poise, dressed in a dark, formal coat embroidered with the Harrogate crest. His silver cravat was fastened with a pin once belonging to his father. In his bearing, there was no hesitation, no tremor, only purpose. At the base of the stairs, he lifted his gaze. Madison met it. A long moment passed, and then he offered her his hand. The hush that fell over the room was thunderous. She descended slowly, the hush rippling wider with every step. Gasps trembled like struck glasses. Lady Mercer clutched her fan so tightly the lace cracked. Lord Haddon narrowed his eyes and muttered something about ruin beneath his breath. But others, those who had known Arthur in his youth, who remembered his silences, his grief, his loyalty, stood taller. Their expression shifted, not in mockery, but in the stunned recognition that something old had ended and something brave had begun. When Madison reached the final step, the Duke did not offer her his arm. He laced their fingers together. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying through the marble like a vow, "permit me the honor of introducing Miss Madison Hale." A beat. Then, the future Duchess of Harrogate. The silence broke like glass. There was no applause. That would come later, in cautious pockets. But for now, the air surged with whispers, scandalized laughter, disbelief, and admiration. Madison did not lower her head. She stood beside the Duke as an equal, her hand in his, her chin high, her breath steady. She had faced storms greater than this. From the far side of the ballroom, Eleanor and Charlotte beamed. Eleanor, ever poised, offered a slight, elegant nod. Charlotte bounced once in her shoes before remembering herself. That night, the Times published a small but unmistakable announcement beneath the society pages. A new charitable trust has been established in the name of Henry Pembroke, in memory of the lost and found. The trust shall provide education, lodging, and dignity to orphaned children across London, under the patronage of the Duke of Harrogate and Miss Hale. But Madison never saw the article. For as the guests lingered into the evening, murmuring and measuring, Arthur led her not to the drawing room, nor to the rose parlour, but to the one place where their story had begun, the portrait gallery. The fire had been lit there for the first time in months. Shadows curled beneath the gilt frames. The air smelled faintly of oil paint, old wood, and something softer. Hope, perhaps. They walked together through the long corridor, past faces of dukes and duchesses long gone. At the far end, above a linen-draped bench, hung the portrait of a boy. The child wore a white tunic. His gaze was direct, solemn, almost questioning. "He still looks like Jacob," Madison whispered. Arthur nodded. "He always will." She stepped forward. Her fingers hovered near the canvas but did not touch. "I used to dream of this gallery," she said, "before I ever saw it, before I knew it existed." He stepped beside her. "What did you dream?" She turned to him. Her eyes, no longer guarded, were luminous in the firelight. "That I would find the truth here, not just about Jacob, but about myself." He studied her in silence, and then, slowly, he knelt. Madison gasped, not from surprise, but from the clarity of it. Arthur removed a small ring box from his coat. He did not open it. He simply held it, as if it were an extension of his heart. "I have no guarantees to offer you, Madison. Only my honesty, my name, my daughters, this house. I do not ask you to become something you are not. I only ask that you continue being precisely who you are." She did not speak. Her throat had tightened with emotion so fierce it hurt. "I ask you," he continued softly, "to be the heart of this home, the one who sees what others fear to face, the one who stood in front of a portrait and changed everything." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, a gold band, delicately engraved with a laurel vine. "Will you," he said, "be my wife?" Madison looked down at him, and this time there was no tremor, no doubt, no fear. "Yes," she said. One word, clear as church bells. He rose, slid the ring onto her hand and gathered her into his arms. She melted against him, her face against his shoulder, her hands fisting into his coat, not because she was uncertain, but because she had never before allowed herself to need. Not like this. In his arms, the weight of years fell away. The ache of hunger, the chill of stone floors, the tears shed in silence, the prayers spoken to a ceiling that never answered. Gone. Here, in the flickering shadows of the gallery, she found the answer at last. Not justice, not vengeance, not restoration, but home. The gardens of Harrogate had never smelled so alive. Spring had unfurled itself with a gentleness reserved for stories that end not in sorrow, but in slow, blooming triumph. The roses had returned first, fat, fragrant, untamed things, and were quickly followed by pale daffodils nodding beneath the hedges, lavender growing along the walkway, and the sweet, lemony scent of magnolia that drifted from the southern wall like memory itself. It was a morning of soft winds and scattered petals, and all of Harrogate House had woken to light. In the courtyard, laughter danced across the cobblestones. Charlotte, now 11, raced her sister around the edge of the fountain, ribbons trailing behind her like banners in a breeze. Eleanor, newly turned 13, no longer hid behind solemn glances and gloves of propriety. Her laugh, once rare and brittle, rang freely now, clear as bells. Madison watched them from the stone bench beneath the wisteria arbor, her hands folded over the lace hem of her cream gown, her eyes warm with a peace she had never dared to imagine. The west wing of the estate, once shuttered and shadowed, now rang with the cheerful voices of girls in grey smocks and neatly braided hair. The Harrogate School for Orphan Girls, small, humble but fierce in its purpose, had opened just 3 months earlier. The little ones were learning letters and needlework, their fingers clumsy but determined, their eyes brimming with the same silent hope Madison had once hidden behind polished shoes and whispered prayers. She had not simply changed the household, she had rewritten its soul. Duchess, came a voice behind her. She turned, and her smile bloomed effortlessly. Arthur stood with Henry, still Jacob in her heart, at his side. The boy held a bundle of wildflowers and clutched them in both hands as if they were a crown. "For the chapel," he said, cheeks flushed. "They're perfect," Madison whispered, crouching to kiss his forehead. At 8 years old, Jacob, Henry to the world, had grown into a thoughtful, curious child. The Trents, who had raised him with quiet grace and a fierce love, continued to be his guardians. They visited often, welcomed not as guests, but as family. He bore the Pembroke cheekbones, though his nose was unmistakably hers. His curls had grown longer, sun-lightened at the tips, and he had a habit of studying people with a steady, listening gaze, as if deciphering truths unsaid. Sometimes when he smiled, Madison felt the breath catch in her chest, not from sorrow but from awe. He had survived so much and yet remained radiant. Today he would stand at the christening of his baby sister. Arthur extended a hand to Madison. She took it without hesitation. They walked together toward the chapel. It was a modest building nestled among hedges and white-blossomed dogwoods, its stone walls softened by age and ivy. Inside, golden sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the pews in rose and sapphire hues. The old vicar, now retired, had returned to bless this child, one he had named himself, with trembling hands. The christening gown had once belonged to Charlotte. Eleanor had stitched new ribbons, and the orphan girls had embroidered the initials A.M.P., Amelia Margaret Pembroke, with tiny, imperfect stitches that made Madison weep when she saw them. As they stepped into the chapel, the hush fell like a blessing. Family, staff, neighbors, orphans and ladies alike filled the benches, pressed lace handkerchiefs to their lips, and watched as Arthur held the child with reverence. She was just 6 weeks old, with a crown of black hair and eyes the color of faded violets. She made no sound, only gazed upward as the water touched her brow and the name was spoken aloud. "Amelia Margaret," the vicar intoned, "may you always walk in truth." Truth. The word rang through the chapel like a secret finally spoken. After the ceremony, they walked back in procession to the gallery, the very room where Madison's world had once cracked open beneath the gaze of a painted boy. Now, a new portrait awaited. The artist had finished it just days earlier, and it had been hung beside the old one in silence, revealed only that morning to the family. Madison stood before it now. It captured not just likeness, but spirit. Arthur standing tall, one hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder. Madison seated with Charlotte at her side and the infant in her arms. Jacob stood in front, not as a hidden child, but as a luminous presence, neither claimed nor erased, but held in full view of the world as he deserved. There was space in the composition, an intentional openness in the frame, as if life itself were still unfolding. Below the first portrait, the boy alone in white, now hung a plaque, "Henry, who taught us truth." Madison's hand trembled as she reached to touch the brass. Truth, not the polished kind displayed for admiration, but the kind that cost something, the kind that asked for courage, the kind she had chased through shadows and ledger books, through silence and doubt, until it lit the corners of this house like dawn. Arthur came to stand behind her. "I used to think this house was made of stone," he said softly. She turned. "And now?" she asked. He looked around the gallery. At the portraits, the light, the children. "Now I think it's made of hearts." She rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, in the gardens, the bells rang once for the new christening, and again for the start of a new chapter. Servants gathered in the courtyard with cake and cider. The children played beneath garlands of forget-me-nots. The West Wing's windows were thrown open, and music drifted out in the lilting strains of a piano, slightly out of tune but deeply sincere. Madison turned toward her family. Eleanor and Charlotte ran to her, pulling at her sleeves, insisting she try the cake. Jacob waited with a shy smile and a paper crown one of the schoolgirls had made for him. Arthur extended his hand again, and when she took it, she felt not only the warmth of his palm, but the echo of every step that had brought her here. She had once been a maid in a house of sorrow. Now she was its heart, not because of titles, not because of portraits, but because she had refused to let the truth be buried, and in doing so, she had given a name to the boy, and a future to the house. The wisteria had climbed higher than ever, its blossoms cascading in heavy, fragrant waterfalls over the west terrace of Harrogate House. Spring had returned once more to the estate, and with it a sense of quiet that only time and earned peace could bestow. 7 years had passed since the morning sunlight filled the chapel for Amelia's christening. The house had changed, yes, but not in the way that a stone facade weathers or a roof darkens. It had softened. It had grown braver. It had lived. Madison stood at the edge of the garden path in her moss-coloured travelling cloak, her gloved hands folded over a leather-bound notebook. Her hair, once pinned with urgency, was now swept back in elegant simplicity, streaked with threads of gold earned by time and grace. She gazed out over the grounds where children laughed, and sunlight painted everything in amber. She had aged, and so had Arthur. But love, true love, had not diminished with the years. It had deepened like the roots of the old oaks surrounding the chapel, unseen but unshakable. Their marriage had not been without storms, but it had endured because it was born from truth, not illusion. Amelia, now 7, darted between the rows of tulips with a wooden sword tucked in her belt and a daisy chain tangled in her curls. Eleanor, at 20, taught arithmetic at the school her stepmother had built. She had rejected her first suitor with admirable diplomacy, determined to find a man who respected both her wit and her quiet strength. Charlotte, radiant at 18, played the pianoforte most evenings, filling the halls with music that turned memories into melody. She was courting a young architect with ink-stained fingers and eyes full of wonder. And Henry, always Henry to the world, though Madison's heart still whispered Jacob in its softest beat, had grown into a young man of 15, with a voice just breaking and a tenderness that disarmed even the most hardened guests. He still lived with the Trents, but spent holidays at Harrogate, where a room remained his, unchanged, but always evolving. He called Madison sister now, with quiet affection, and called Arthur sir, with unspoken reverence. A future was being forged for him, not as a duke, not as a pawn, but as himself. The school had doubled in size. Girls who once arrived barefoot now read Shakespeare beneath cherry trees. Some stayed on as tutors, some left to marry, to teach, to open shops. Each carried with them the truth Harrogate had taught, that dignity was not the privilege of birth, but the right of every soul brave enough to claim it. But not all fates had been as kind. Mrs. Blythe, loyal and rigid to the end, had retired 5 years earlier. She now lived alone in Yorkshire, tending roses no one picked and rereading her old ledgers like scripture. She had refused to attend the christening of Amelia and never uttered Jacob's name again. Mr. Ashcombe, the steward who had kept the secret of the boy's origin, passed quietly in his sleep the winter after the reception. Arthur paid for a private nurse, and Madison visited often in his final weeks. He died with her hand in his, whispering, "Tell the boy I never meant harm." The cousin who had once stirred scandal among the ton now lived in social obscurity, her venom having turned against her in drawing rooms where reputation was currency. No one invited her anymore. Even the Times had ceased to mention her. Arthur had changed the most and yet the least. The Duke of Harrogate no longer walked in silence. He laughed now, not often, but with sincerity. He danced at Eleanor's birthday with his youngest in his arms. He spoke publicly at gatherings for orphan reform, established a home for abandoned infants outside of Kent, and wrote letters to Parliament demanding laws that protected the nameless children cast aside in alleys and under bridges. He remained a man of stature, but now he was also a man of story, of one story in particular, a story whispered in the back galleries by visiting governesses, a story told by schoolgirls who peered into the portrait room and pointed to the plaque beneath the boy's painting, Henry who taught us truth. That morning, as the bells rang out again, this time for Eleanor's engagement to the young vicar who had replaced Reverend Trent, Madison returned to the gallery one last time before the guests arrived. She stood before the two portraits, the old and the new, the boy in white, his face still as solemn as the day she had first seen him, and beside him the living painting of her family, Arthur, herself, Eleanor, Charlotte, and little Amelia holding Jacob's hand, behind them open space. The artist had left it blank, framed by ivy, as if saying, "Life continues," and it had. Madison reached into her notebook and slipped a pressed violet into the crack of the frame. A quiet ritual. One she had done every spring since that day 7 years ago. Footsteps echoed gently on the marble. Arthur entered, dressed in his dark blue formal coat, silver threads at his temples. He paused beside her and followed her gaze. "She would have been proud," he murmured. Madison turned to him. "Who?" "Your mother," he said, "and perhaps mine." Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. She leaned into his shoulder, and he took her hand as he always had, not with command, but with understanding. "I still remember," she whispered. "The first time I saw that painting, I thought my heart would burst." Arthur smiled, his voice quiet. "And I thought my world had shattered. But it hadn't," she said. "It was just beginning." From the garden, bells pealed again. Laughter rose with the scent of lilacs. Madison turned back once more before leaving the gallery, one hand brushing the plaque's warm metal. Love, she knew now, was not forged in grand declarations. It was built in the silences, in the years between storms, in the unwavering choice to keep holding on, even when everything seemed lost. And as long as Harrogate stood, so would that truth. In a world where truth is often silenced and love is weighed against legacy, the maid who found her brother in a duke's portrait reminds us that the most powerful transformations begin not in ballrooms or courtrooms, but in quiet acts of courage. Madison Hale taught us that persistence, even when met with scorn, can crack the walls of the most formidable manor. That tenderness can awaken a grieving heart. That family is not always blood, but the people who choose to protect your soul. And that the past, no matter how painful, can be rewritten with compassion and truth. If this story touched you, moved you, or simply made you believe in love again, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you made it all the way to this moment, write the word truth in the comments, so we'll know you stayed with us until the very last page of this journey. Your presence here means the world to us. If you feel called to support the team that brings these timeless tales to life, you can leave a super thanks on YouTube with whatever amount feels right for you. Every gesture, big or small, helps keep the candle of storytelling burning. And if now isn't the right time, that's more than okay. Just sharing this video with someone you care about is already a beautiful way to help this story reach more hearts. Don't forget to check out the other historical romances I've carefully chosen and left for you in the video cards. Each one is filled with longing, honor, sacrifice, and love that defies the ages. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for believing in stories like this. May you carry its truth with you always.